drunkard's path unit can be an excellent way to add a little bit of a softness to a project. Today we're going to be working with the cousin of the drunkard's path block, and it's this one here, the elongated drunkard's path block. This one can add a lot of interest just because of its unusual shape. I'm going to share with you how to make this today. Let's move over to the work table. Before we move over to the sewing machine, I wanted to start out with just looking at the difference between a standard drunkard's path block and the elongated drunkard's path block. Obviously, you will notice on the L unit that that's where you see the majority of the difference. Here on the ends of the L unit, they are the same. With the elongated drunkard's path, you have one side that is longer, which I think adds a lot of interest to a project, which is why I use the block a lot. Again, with any PDF pattern, it's important to make sure that you check the 1-inch control square to make sure that you have your templates the right size. I've prepared 1 unit of the standard drunkard's path and 1 unit of the elongated drunkard's path. Important to mention, especially if you are using printed fabric, this is actually a basic gray grunge fabric, and there is a printed side and there is a non-printed side. Whenever you are cutting for a standard drunkard's path, it's okay to use a layered yardage because the unit, the L unit, will fit on the block no matter which direction you use the block in your project. For the elongated drunkard's path unit, especially if you're using a printed fabric or directional fabric, it is important to make sure that you take into consideration that when you layer your yardage, then you will end up with 1 left-facing unit and you will end up with 1 right-facing unit. So printed fabric, and then your curve unit will not match in both of those. If you're using solids, then this does not apply. But especially if you're using a printed fabric, it's important to take that into consideration if you want left-facing or right-facing drunkard's path blocks. Another thing to consider whenever you're sewing your drunkard's path blocks is that with the drunkard's path unit, you always start with the L unit on top, whether it's this way and pinning it, or if you're using the no pin and ease method. Now, the one thing with the elongated drunkard's path block is that it's actually easier whenever you put the curve unit on top, like this. This is how I would go to the sewing machine and sew, because I prefer to sew without pins. But if you're a little uncertain with yourself and you prefer to sew with pins, it's just important to know that it's going to be a little bit more fiddly than whenever you're sewing with the standard drunkard's path block. So here I've aligned the straight edges of the curve unit to the L unit, and I'm going to place my first pin there. The next part that you're going to match up is here, this end piece where it curves around. Now, this is a little different in the fact that you're not marking the center of the block like what you would for a standard drunkard's path block. Put the pin in there, and it's easier to pin first on the straighter part of the block. And it's important as you're pinning to not pull. Now, I've added a light layer of starch to this, and it makes it a little easier with pinning. So there you would just simply sew a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and as you go, you may have to even take a pin to kind of make sure that your seam allowances are lined up. So let's move over to the sewing machine. So we're going to begin with the pinned unit from the last segment, and we're just going to make sure that everything is lined up here before we put it under the presser foot. And I'm going to adjust that a little bit because it can be a little bit of a challenge to get that first starting point just right. Needle down and I begin sewing. And as you go, you're going to have to lift the unit. You can see on the back side. Just make sure that this is not catching here, and this, it's not being folded over as you sew. If I am sewing over pins, I will make sure that I put the needle down shortly before the pin. And just remember, you can readjust as you go. Here I'm using my knee lift to lift up my presser foot. And if you watched my videos on sewing Drunkard's Path units, you know that it's all about going slow. And readjust to get that last part. Hopefully you can see this. Here I'm going to take out the last pin and try to reposition that manually. A couple stitches, reposition. So let's see how that turned out. I'm actually fairly pleased about this one because I matched up fairly well, although there's a little room for improvement for trimming, and I'll show you that in the next step. And let's move on to the no pin method. Again, you place your curved unit on top and align the straight edges here. Needle down a few stitches and then gently lift the curve to realign the edges. Now perhaps if you feel more comfortable with pinning, this method may not be the best for you. But since I've allowed plenty of room for trimming, you might want to give it a try. Now here I notice I perhaps did not pivot the fabric enough, and I think I'm going to end up with more fabric in the end. And each time you see that presser foot lift, that's me using the knee lift. Now this one I have a little bit more over, but I'm going to clean that up during trimming. Here it starts out right, but I'm going to have to correct this during trimming. I'll show you this in the next step. So now we're ready to trim the elongated Drunkard's Path units that we've sewn. Here's a unit that I've already trimmed up to the proper size, and we'll come back to that in a little bit. This is the unit that I did with the pinning method. Here you can see, even though the edges are matched up pretty nicely, this has gotten a little wavy here and a little wavy here. Now here's the unit that I actually used using the no pin method, and I was really off here, although I'm lined up pretty well here. So I'll show you how you can correct those two. we're going to begin by squaring up this unit here. A lot of times you can line up this L unit here and it matches. I'm going to pull it down just a tad, and you can see how wavy this has gotten here in the end. This is exactly why I make the blocks larger, because even though I've essentially hit the starting and stopping points, just because the fabric is cut on the curve and has a tendency to stretch a little bit, here you can correct it. So I'm just going to do a quick trim on this side and again over here, and now I can start trimming to the proper size. One thing to remember is to try to trim your blocks in the same manner on every unit. And what I mean by that is here I have approximately 3/4 of an inch on this side of the L unit, and again the same up here. If you have your L unit this way, it's fine. If you want even less, just remember that whenever you're trimming, to trim all your units the same. So here I'm going to first line up at the 3.5 inch mark here, coming over 3.5 inches here, and then here on the 5.5 inch mark. 5.5, 3.5, and I want to make sure that this is lined up here. I'm actually at the 3/4 on all sides, so I'm good, and I know that I can trim that. So now on this block where I did not pin, let's flip it around and see how that unit comes out. It's not as wavy as the one that I pinned. So I'm going to square this up down here, turn it around, and then I should be able to trim the same way that I've done the other units. Again at 3.5 and 5.5. Now here I'm a little bit over, so I'm actually going to, in this case, I'm going to align it and then retrim the other side, just so that way I have all the units with the same amount of seam allowance on them. Oops. 3/4 here and 3/4 here. Normally I'm not doing as much trimming, but in this instance I want to show you how to kind of fix the little mistake that I made. So there are your elongated drunkard's path blocks. For this and other tutorials, remember to visit campbellsoupdiary.com.